between Hamilton and Madison and Adams, where on one side and Jefferson on the other, where Jefferson thought everybody should be given them, which at that point was all males, the capacity to vote. And Madison, Adams, and Hamilton said, no, it should only go to the landed gentry. And they didn't say that because they were anti-democratic, but they understood that people who were uneducated, and most people who didn't have land at that time were uneducated, and that they would easily, without education, without proper information, that cohort would easily fall to the seductions of demagogues, and they would give away the constitutional rights that the revolutionary generation had won for us. So they said, we can't allow uneducated people to vote because they will fall, that the demagogues using these alchemies of demagoguery will be able to seduce them into relinquishing their constitutional rights. And so one of the things that happened, in Virginia and Massachusetts and all of these other states, the state constitutions, because Jefferson made the argument, I agree with you, but the remedy is not to deprive the people of unlanded peoples of their vote, on property people of their vote, but rather to forcibly educate them, to make sure that the entire population is educated and able to process information critically, to read and write, to think for themselves. And so the states like Massachusetts, Virginia did something that nobody had done in history, which is to mandate public education and to require people to do that. So in 1926, when radios started proliferating, Congress took a look at that and said, we will lose our democracy if we let this potent form of communication fall into the hands of large corporations who will operate it not for the good of democracy, but for their own profit. So they passed a law, which we now call the Fairness Doctrine, that required the federal, it was the beginning of the Federal Communications Act, required that TV and radio must stay separate from newspaper ownership, and that it had to be, there couldn't be national stations, that they had to be locally controlled so that you get a multiplicity of voices and of attitudes. And that fell apart in 1986. Ronald Reagan essentially abolished the Fairness Doctrine, and it allowed it as a favor to the big studio heads who had gotten them elected and who wanted to control all of the media. And as a result of that, we now have, I think, 4 companies that control all of our radio, all of our television, all of our newspapers. And as I said, the billboards, and those companies are now under the control largely of these 2 financial behemoths. And the political power that has accrued to BlackRock and to Vanguard, which you talk about in this article, is extraordinary. They basically have the capacity now to manufacture wealth. They were, because of their political clout, their media control, President Obama designated them in the Treasury Department in 2008 to buy up all the toxic assets from the 2007-2008 financial collapse, which was like printing money for those companies. And in 2020, BlackRock received another no-bid contract from the U.S. Treasury to manage the $454 billion fund under the Coronavirus Relief and Economic Security Act, which is called CARES, for businesses adversely impacted by COVID lockdowns. So, they get the government contracts, they get to basically print money, and and now they're profiting from the lockdown by using all of their surplus cash to buy up virtually, an unprecedented purchase of residential real estate in this country. where they're buying whole neighborhoods and whole regions, and they're displacing people from their homes, turning them into rental properties, and bringing to fruition the World Economic Forum promise that you will own nothing. You will be happy, but you will own nothing.
Absolutely. I mentioned this in my piece, but it warrants really its own separate article. BlackRock and Vanguard have been on a buying spree, in some instances buying entire neighborhoods, and in many cases is holding on to these houses. So this creates an artificial shortage in the marketplace, which, as you can then imagine, drives up the prices of both rentals and home purchases as well. So it's artificially driving up the prices on the marketplace. And as you can imagine, Vanguard and BlackRock having the ability to actually buy massive amounts of properties stand to benefit from a real estate market where those property values are then going up. So it's a very similar strategy all across the different sectors of the economy that they are operating in, which has, and the common thread is that it's so anti-competitive. If we go back to the media for a moment, you mentioned the fairness doctrine that eliminated this diversity of voices that previously one could find on the public airwaves. There were a couple of other laws as well that went into the wastebasket at around the same time. One, I believe, was called the Equal Time Rule or the Equal Time Act, which basically prevented broadcast stations from operating sort of as a one-party platform. So if they brought a candidate on from one party, they had to offer equal time to the candidate from the other party if it was requested, and so forth. And then there were also ownership caps, and those began to be watered down in the 80s as well. And then they were further watered down in the 90s with the Telecommunications Act of 96. And then there's been further loosening of those restrictions, and now actually major radio groups are asking for these caps to, in some cases and in some markets, to be repealed completely. So you could have a situation in the not too distant future where the same company, the exact same company, owns all of the commercial stations in the market, and it would be perfectly legal. And then if we go up the ladder, we see that whether it's company A or company B or company C that owns these radio or TV stations, like we mentioned before, Sinclair Media, they operate a lot of the local TV stations in local markets around the US. There's all these videos one could find on YouTube and on other platforms like this that show snippets of newscasts from all sorts of different places, whether it's like Tucson, Arizona, or Boise, Idaho, or Burlington, Vermont. Same script, same news story, same exact language, and it makes sense. They're owned by the same company. But then whether we're talking about Sinclair or any of these other media owners, going up the ladder, we see that above them, companies like BlackRock and Vanguard are major shareholders there. So it is a danger for our democracy. It is a danger for our economy, as we saw with the housing example. And it all comes back to a situation that is grossly anti-competitive.
For the sake of our listeners, I know you know this, but let me just paint a portrait of a different view of America and the way things were under the fairness doctrine when it was still operating. There was a case, and I think it was in the 70s or early 80s, but it was a case against one of the networks, were sued by a large group like the American Heart Association or an asthma association, because they were airing ads for Mustang, which was the most fuel inefficient automobile at that time. And the group that was the asthma advocacy group, they're advertising something that is making our lives more difficult, and we need extra time. We need a guarantee equal time so that we can explain why that automobile is actually hurting another group of Americans. And the Supreme Court upheld that. And so The networks, it was recognized that the airwaves were owned by the public, the same as our rivers and our shorelines are owned by the public, that the government could license those networks to use the airwaves, but ultimately they had to use them for a public purpose. And so they said to the networks, you have to reserve 30 minutes a day to tell the Americans the truth about the news. And that's why at that point in history, you had these really respected news anchors and producers of the evening news who were untouchable. And all these people who were managing the news stations and who were managing them for the American public and who were making sure that what they put on the news was actually truthful and was not ideologically driven. You could talk against Vietnam, as Walter Cronkite did at that time, without being punished. The American people were listening and they believed the news. After the Fairness Doctrine was abolished, the news stations were money losers for all the networks. They were losing huge amounts of money, but they needed to operate those news stations in order to maintain their licenses to sell entertainment for the other 23 and a half hours a day. They sacrificed that one time at 6 o'clock, as Congress told them there's got to be one time at night, and every American can watch TV and can find out the facts are relevant to policy making and to our democracy, and you need to give them those facts. The networks took their hands off the news departments. They appointed really highly respected individuals to run them, and then they didn't touch them. And they understood they were going to lose millions of dollars a year telling the news, but that was part of the condition of keeping their license, to do that service for democracy. And then after 1986, the networks, when Reagan changed the law, the networks started telling their news departments, the bean counters in these networks, you got to make money, you got to get audiences. So they started putting car crashes on, and if it bleeds, it leads, and gossip, and who's going out with Brad Pitt. All of this became news because it was drawing viewership, and then increasingly ideological driven news hours, which have now polarized and divided our country. But that's not the way it started. That's not the way it operated prior to 1986. And Americans were much better informed and much better at democracy at that point. And the monopolization of the evening news, as you said, where they've got this kind of fake, fight between CNN and Fox News, which is all orchestrated by BlackRock to maximize profits by extracting, by commoditizing everything, including the news, is something that most Americans should be regarding as really sinister, exploitive, and dangerous.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, if you look at cable news, like CNN and Fox News and MSNBC, they're not even under any sort of FCC regulation at this time, even to the limited extent that broadcast over-the-air networks like CBS and NBC and ABC are. So they can get away with even more than what their broadcast counterparts can. But even what their broadcast counterparts can do today is significantly more relaxed from a regulatory standpoint than it was up until the 1980s. So it's created this sort of perfect storm where you have what I would even describe as blatantly ideological. I hesitate to even call it news a lot of the time. It's commentary. It's a lot of things, but it's not hard news reporting, unfortunately, and it's not, in many cases, truthful reporting. And then if we look at the internet is not regulated in the same way that, let's say, telephone networks were regulated way back when. And I'm not saying that the government needs to come in and start censoring. Obviously, there's a lot of views on the internet that do not get onto the airwaves or cable. But there is, however, something sinister about the fact that the major pipelines that people use to connect to the internet are companies that in many cases are associated with the what we call the mainstream media, and in turn associated with BlackRock and Vanguard. So I'll give just one example. NBC is owned by Comcast. Comcast also is a major internet service provider. So a company like Comcast, especially in a situation where net neutrality rules are far from perfect and do not apply to all sorts of things, including, from what I understand, the mobile internet, and more people are getting online through their mobile devices, it creates a situation where they can switch off certain services or provide preferential access to certain sources of information at the expense of others. And then what we've seen now in the European Union is the EU has net neutrality, and yet they've blocked entire news websites from the entire continent, from most members of the public being able to access those sites, just because they were reporting a narrative different from the one that most EU governments want to present to the public. So there's a dangerous situation, and there's a lot of holes from a regulatory standpoint that are allowing this to take place. And I think, again, it comes back to the fact that if all of these major internet service providers, major media outlets, et cetera, are operated or are owned by a couple of companies like Vanguard and BlackRock, those companies, if their total valuation is larger by far than, for instance, the GDP of Germany, which is Europe's largest economy and most powerful economy, that shows you just how strong these companies are. They have larger GDPs. If their valuation was a GDP, they have a larger GDP than most countries in the world. So this means they have massive political influence. And he gave those examples before from the Obama administration and from 2020, no bid contracts and just receiving these major deals from government. In a situation like that, I would think that politicians would be very reluctant to enforce a heavy hand of regulation against those same companies.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back, like I said, when the companies became, or the news divisions became profit centers. They went from independent, untouchable entities within, that were part of kind of the licensing fee. You're going to tell the news, the real news, and they became profit centers for the network. And the network bean counters came in and said, you got to get more viewership, so put on more about, Hollywood gossip, put more on violence, put anything that, is going to make more viewership and allow us to sell more ad revenue, get eyeballs on your site. We don't care if it's true or not true. Prior to 1986, remember this, consider this, if the evening news put something on the air that was not true, any viewer could petition the FCC to pull their license and basically destroy the network. So they were terrified of putting anything on that even got close to the line of not being true. And you had appointed to run these news divisions the most respectable journalists in the world, who would make sure, who would fact check, who would make sure that what they were putting on was important for Americans to understand in order to make rational choices about political policies, about foreign policies, and they had to make sure it was true. If it wasn't true, then the FCC could come in and pull their license and give it to somebody else. And, now it's a Wild West, and there's no regulation of the cable news, and there's almost no regulation of the airwaves.
That's very true. And I think it also, we've been talking about the economics of it all, but it has major societal effects, in my opinion. I think that in recent years, even before COVID, we're seeing a trend in the US certainly, and also I've seen this in many European countries as well. Society is just more polarized, and people just sort of join one camp or the other camp, and they find not just a media outlet that, in a sense, becomes sort of like their echo chamber, but also they kind of begin to, in the same way that the media might sensationalize the news or turn their what they call their news coverage into a shouting match or into an us versus them type of proposition, that kind of trickles down to the public. And there's no room in that sort of landscape for reasoned debate. You've brought up the fairness doctrine. When you hear multiple viewpoints on the same station, that encourages reasoned debate. That reasoned debate, I think, has gone out the window, not just in the media, but unfortunately also quite often in broader society as well. And it leads to all sorts of just ugly situations where over any given issue, whether it's vaccine mandates or whether it's what's going on now in the Ukraine and Russia, it leads to just nasty situations where, everyone sort of just picks up their ball and goes home, and no one wants to hear the other side out and try to find some common ground and also identify the areas where they disagree and agree to disagree. There's a lot less of that. And so I feel it creates a toxic situation for society in addition to being a toxic situation economically.
Yeah, and here's something that people should think about. And it's exactly along the lines of what you're saying. There's this illusion that CNN and Fox are opposite sides of a political spectrum. If you actually look at the debate that occurs there, there's a lot of poison, there's a lot of smoke, there's a lot of anger and vitriol and name calling. But both networks, if you look at their coverage of COVID, it was almost identical. There was no experts on what are the lockdowns going to do to the economy. There was nobody going on and saying, let's look at the mask, the science. Let's see, do masks work? Let's get some people on here. There's hundreds of studies about this. Let's get some of the scientists on to talk about alternative views, social distancing, the vaccines, etc. There are many, many experts who differ. There were people who were like Pierre Corey and Peter McCulloch from the beginning who were saying we should be looking at these repurposed medications. There was not a spot for them on either network. Now, recently, there's a few journalists like Tucker Carlson and others who will let their voices on, but it was in the very tail end of the COVID pandemic that these alternative voices on one of the networks were given airtime. But throughout the whole time, they were all for warp speed, they were all for lockdowns, they were all for masking, all for social distancing. Nobody's asking about the impact on the poor. Nobody's asking about the impact on children. None of that was discussed on either network. And the debates that they do have, which are filled with this, smoke and fire and anger, are kind of, they're ridiculous debates. They're debates about whether or not we should build a wall. With one side saying yes, one side, listen, if you wanted to end the immigration problem in this country, there's an easy way to do it overnight. Put one employer in jail for hiring illegal immigrants, and it's over. There's no jobs left. You prosecute people for illegal. You don't have to build a wall. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to have patrols on the Southwest. It's all kind of contrived debates about Black Lives Matter, et cetera. They're all on the fringes and don't go to the central concerns of Americans at this point in history. The central concerns, there's always a consensus. There's a consensus right now in the Ukraine. There's no difference between the Fox coverage of the Ukraine and CNN coverage. Everybody wants to go in and have a war. It's the same thing when we went into Iraq. The voices of dissent, of real dissent, are not occurring in our society. And, if your incredible journalism You're tracking how all of these people are owned by the same financial entities is a good explanation about why that never happens. So thank you very much. We all follow your writings on Children's Health Defense, on the Defender, and I urge you, if you haven't read Michael Neverdakis' writing, Dr. Michael Neverdakis, please go to the Defender, read his recent article, Corporate Vaccine Mandates and Vaccine Passports, brought to you by BlackRock and Vanguard, and follow his regular reporting in the Defender.